for joining us today. The OHSU AMA Medical Student Section is proud to host a discussion on House Bill 2300, also known as Right to Try. We have a great lineup of panelists today, hosted by our moderator, Alan Melnick. Thank you so much to the Benjamin Rush Institute and the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for sponsoring our discussion today. If we advance one slide, we're going to go through some speaker introductions. We're going to talk about the structure of our discussion today, and then Dr. Basham is going to give a brief overview of what House Bill 2300 is, and then the discussion will happen. So first we have Alan Melnick, who's MD, MPH, CPH, Public Health Director and Health Officer for Clark County, Washington, also Adjunct Associate Professor at the OHSU School of Medicine. Next we have Dr. Lissy Hansen, who is an RN PhD Associate Professor at the OHSU School of Nursing with extensive work in bioethics, palliative medicine, and end-of-life care. Then we have Chris Griffin, who is an MD, MBA, FACHE, physician executive with 25 years of experience as a radiologist and healthcare experience and leadership, OHSU alum, and currently attends Lewis and Clark Law School. Next, we have Jeremy Setnar, who's a MD, MSH, PR, assistant professor for the OHSU Department of Medicine and board certified in internal medicine, hematology, oncology. Then we have Kurt Altman, who's a JD, National Policy Advisor and General Counsel for the Goldwater Institute, and one of the original drafters of the model legislation for Right to Try that's kind of coursing throughout the nation now. Finally, we have Chandra Basham, who's an MD, did her MD at Hopkins and her residency training in family medicine here at OHSU. She is currently at the Portland VA Medical Center and is completed her externship at the Oregon State Legislature, and is also a student at Lewis and Clark Law School. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Melnick, who's going to talk to us about the process that he is going to be using to help focus the discussion. Thank you.
Great. So rather than having a out-and-out debate where folks kind of go at each other, we're going to try to make this more of an ethical deliberation. And actually, we've used this. I've been teaching on this. We have an ethics committee in our health department, and we really use an ethical deliberation to help us work through an issue and think about how we make decisions, and then actually use it to justify a decision that we might make. So just to give you an idea of what it looks like is, first, there's really 3 steps to this process. So around the right to try issue, we're going to talk about, we're going to work with the panel here, and actually we welcome participation from the audience as well. Pretend that you're on the panel as well. Is to identify, what the goals are of this legislation. Really, what are we trying to do here? What are the risks and harms of concerns about this, and not only the legislation, but also comparing it to the status quo, because we have a decision here to make whether to, go with the status quo or support this legislation. Really important piece of this deliberation is who are the stakeholders, and we certainly have this panel and we have folks in the audience here. We're going to really try to work with the panel and identify who all the stakeholders may be, and as it says there, what are their moral claims? Because all of us bring a different perspective to this, to any issue. We all have moral claims about this, and no moral claim is absolute. Nobody is all right, nobody is all wrong. We all have real different claims to assert here, and we'll try to tease that out in part of this deliberation. We have attorneys here, so we're going to have a presentation on the legislation itself, and maybe briefly mention whether there are any precedent cases that are relevant. If we have time, we can talk about codes of ethics as well. We probably won't spend a whole lot of time on that. Step 2 is, and we'll probably look at it in terms of, and hopefully we'll have enough time to get to this, is as we talk through the right to try legislation, we're going to look at whether we're going to weigh it in terms of utility, whether this would produce an overall balance of benefit over harms, Justice, if this legislation passes, are the benefits and harms distributed equitably? Are there specific populations that are more likely to be benefited or more likely to be harmed? Does it support individual, we're going to do a lot of talking about this, is does the legislation respect individual choices and interests, liberty, autonomy, things like that? And if we work through this, if this legislation passes, what does it mean in terms of respect for legitimate public institutions, including medicine, nursing, pharmaceutical and the industry as well? And then finally, hopefully, when we get to a point where we can talk about a course of action around this legislation, if it passes, is it likely to be effective? Whatever happens, is it likely to be effective? Will the benefits outweigh any infringed moral considerations that hopefully we'll tease out? Is it really necessary to do this? Again, are the benefits and burdens distributed fairly? Is this, whatever we come up with this in terms of the goal we already have, is the action of the legislation least restrictive? And can we actually justify this to ourselves as well as the public in the long run? Of course, obviously, this may be up to, the legislature may do that for us. But hopefully we'll get to that point. So I'm hoping that we can work through the steps with the panel. And I think the next step is actually to have Chandra really talk about the legislation itself.
That's great. Thanks so much for that introduction. Before coming to speak here this evening, I consulted with the VA Ethics Council and reviewed 22 federal statutes and regulations relating to my rights to associate and speak in public, and determined that the following disclaimer is necessary before I proceed. And that is that the views are my own. They don't expressly or impliedly indicate any endorsement on the part of any institution which I have been or am currently associated, including the Veterans Affairs, Oregon State Legislature, and Lewis and Clark Law School. That said, thank you so much for being here. I'm very excited to see some medical students taking a study break. It's very important for healthcare providers to be involved in health policy. Only about 4% of our national representatives are physicians, and that's even smaller in the state of Oregon, so there's a huge shortage of physicians in politics and policy. So thank you so much for being here. I got involved with House Bill 2300 as part of an externship with Lewis and Clark Law School, and worked on the bill. It passed unanimously in the House, so it's not a partisan piece of legislation. So my role is really just to lay out the bill for you and kind of the mechanics of it, and then we can get into the arguments that are on both sides of the bill. So House Bill 2300, popular term is right to try. The goal of the legislation is to provide investigational devices and medications to terminally ill patients. These products must be in phase 2 or greater in the FDA approval process. In other words, they've been through phase 1, some toxicities are known, there are unclear benefits. And these medications and devices also have to be something that a provider and a patient decide are going to be worthwhile for the patient to try. We could advance to the next slide. So the key pieces of the legislation are that it is voluntary for everybody involved, the patients, the providers, the healthcare facilities, and the manufacturers. The policy in Oregon in particular, we worked very carefully on a piece of the legislation to ensure that this does not affect hospice decisions for patients. So in other words, if there's an investigational product or device that is palliative in nature, a patient doesn't have to go off hospice in order to try a medication that's not FDA approved. And the other key piece is that it's not publicly funded. So it's up to each individual and the healthcare provider and the patient to decide who's going to bear the cost. There is a limit on that cost. So the bill is written so that patients cannot be charged more than the cost of manufacture and administration, but it's up to the facilities and the providers whether they want to provide that free of charge or not. You can advance. Right to try has some sideboards for safety, so that means 2 physicians have to certify that the patient is terminally ill and that their prognosis is less than 1 year. That's a peculiarity of the Oregon legislation. Most of the legislation out there does not require the patient to have a prognosis of less than 1 year, nor does the FDA's sort of mirror image program of expanded access. There's no indication of prognosis there either, and it's merely dictated by whether the patient has a terminal illness. In Oregon, the patient has to be over 15, which is also a peculiarity in the Oregon legislation. Other states who've passed this legislation have not put in that provision and have allowed access to terminally ill children to investigational products. There's also a pretty detailed statutory informed consent process to ensure that the patient knows what the investigational product is being used for, that not all the risks are known, and that they know of the risks. And in Oregon, we also have a provision which Mr. Altman will be able to tell us a little bit more about what other states have done with this, but insurance lobbied pretty heavily in Oregon to have a provision placed in the bill that would require the providers to indicate to the patient's insurance company that they're receiving the treatment. That's for two reasons. One is that right to try therapies will not be covered by insurance. That's true in every state where this legislation is passed. But in Oregon, the insurance companies also want to ensure that they won't be paying for any adverse effects from the medication. And the standard there will be medical evidence indicating that the medication, the investigational product or medication caused the adverse effect. So we can advance through. A lot of this we can hash out later if you want to advance through. So physicians and facilities will have a waiver of liability so long as they've done the informed consent process prescribed by statute, and as long as they're not grossly negligent in administering the product. Physicians cannot be disciplined by boards or associations for participating in right to try as long as they've gone through the informed consent process and their facility has not declined to participate in the right to try program. We can advance. So some of this we'll get into as we deliberate, but as I was preparing for this, was thinking about Brittany Maynard, who's 29, and she moved to Oregon. You may have heard about her in the news, but she moved to Oregon because she had metastatic brain cancer, and as her personality changed and she was in more pain, she didn't want to have someone else have control of how she ended her life. And so she moved to Oregon with her husband, and she has kind of a beautiful story. And she says, you know, I would not tell anyone that they should or should not choose right to die. My question is, who has the right to tell me I don't deserve the choice? Well, we've provided that choice for people like Brittany, but we haven't provided that choice for people. If you want to advance a couple more slides.
Yeah, I mean, I want to advance this. I don't want to get into one side or the other. I just want to talk about what the legislation is about. So we're going to get into it.
Okay, and we can just advance through these. So there's other choices for patients with terminal illness, and some of them, like Diego Morris, who came to Oregon to advocate for this legislation, actually moved out of the country to get access to therapies that weren't FDA approved. And so I think it's an important question that we're talking about tonight. A big piece of that is patient choice. And a big part of it is that the risk-benefit analysis at the end of life for the individual patient, for the provider, and what they value at the end of life may be different. And so the question is, should we change the way we analyze what we provide to them and what care we provide? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So you'll know whether I'm doing a decent job of moderating or not if you can't tell which side of the issue I'm on, because I'm going to do my best to not exhibit any bias here, although we all have some bias. I'm going to ask the panelists to be as brief as possible as we go through this. And certainly if folks in the audience want to weigh in on some of these issues, they're more than welcome to. So I'd like to start with any of the panelists here is, you know, we heard about the goal of the legislation, but basically what are the underlying goals behind this? And anybody can kind of speak to that. What are we trying to achieve?
Well, I think I can speak to that to begin with. Obviously, as the law was just laid out to you all, the underlying goal of this is to bring investigational new medicines as really a last resort to terminally ill patients, bring them closer, bring that medication closer to home, closer to their local community, give them better access than they currently have. The goal of this legislation is not to guarantee any result. The goal is to create opportunities. Even if those opportunities are small or long shots, they're opportunities that aren't there today. And right to try legislation here in Oregon and around the country is aimed at bringing those opportunities to where they're needed most, to the local community where these terminal patients exist.
So just in trying to tease that out further, so is the goal to give people the opportunity to live longer or to get cured, or just asking that if that's part of the goal of this?
My answer to that would be yes, yes, and yes. Certainly, if there's something out there that could cure somebody, give them the potential of a cure, we want that. If somebody wants to live another month, another 2 months, because that's what they have decided is in their best interest, then that's part of the goal as well. So the answer to all those questions would be yes.
Okay. Anybody else on the panel want to, at least whether you're for this or against this, the underlying goal behind this legislation, if anybody else wants to weigh in on that. Do we all agree that's the goal of the legislation, or is there any disagreement there?
I would say that's part of the goal, but there are other goals at the end of life. We kind of rushed through some of the slides, but I think about a lot of my patients who are just, they're fighters inside and they want to throw a last punch. And even if that doesn't necessarily prolong their life, they want to try. As Diego Morris said when he was here, he wasn't looking for a guarantee, he just wanted a chance. And I think a lot of patients want to feel like they have tried everything. It's not every patient, but I think we offer something as healthcare providers when we provide a choice, especially for those patients who are fighters, that there's something therapeutic that we're providing by allowing them to try.
I totally agree. And I just want to add something to think about is that it has been written in Milwaukee Journal Sentinel that there were 54 new cancer drugs that was really the last decade allowed by the FDA, and they actually did not extend life. So I think we really have to think about how much a goal really will extend life for these patients.
So we're going to get into the next round here. So you're anticipating the next question here. So I think we heard about what the goals are. It sounds like more autonomy or choice for patients at the end of life, a chance to prolong their life or to be cured. I think that's what we've heard. So before we get into the stakeholder piece here, because we're going to try to tease out who all the stakeholders are, what are the risks and potential? We've heard about some of the goals of this. What are some of the potential risks and harms of concern with right to try?
So, as Shai had said, I'm a medical oncologist, and part of my job is to open clinical trials. So I'm very active as a clinical researcher here. I've opened up phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials. I'm a principal investigator on several of them. And my two specialties are genital urinary malignancies and thoracic oncology. Thoracic oncology specifically is a very aggressive, horrible cancer. So I very frequently treat patients who are dying. And I think being a member of and a very strong advocate for clinical trials, I see on a very frequent basis a lot of the harm that some of these therapies can cause. I think it's unrealistic to think that any one of these therapies is going to be 100% effective or a cure. I think there may be some out there that do achieve that, but I think the vast majority of therapies that we're talking about here are not curative and may improve somebody's lifespan, but also at the cost of toxicity. I can tell you that we don't know ahead of time who is going to respond to some of these. and we absolutely don't know who's going to have tremendous toxicity. I've seen people's faces peel off. I've seen people have horrible kidney damage, liver failure, all sorts of things, because to be honest with you, we don't know a lot about these therapies that sometimes when they go into clinical trials. After it gets through phase 1, obviously we know what we think is the most therapeutic dose. I'm sorry, the dose that has caused the least side effects. And then in phase 2 studies, we try to look for a signal for efficacy. So there's many different facets to clinical trial research, but the very easy answer to what are the harms of this is, well, the patient could be harmed. And I understand the counter argument to this is if somebody's willing to undergo that risk, they should have that right. But I'm going to also say that these clinical trials are run very carefully in conjunction with the FDA. Imagine that there is a very effective, powerful medication for, let's say, lung cancer. And imagine that a large proportion of people receive this not through the extended access program, but through this bill. And let's say that they have, by chance, very bad side effects, even death. Will that decrease the chance of that drug being approved by the FDA for the rest of the population? I don't think anybody here at this panel can give me a guarantee that that's not going to happen. So from a population perspective, one may argue that this may not be the most beneficial thing because, again, if you've got 1 or 2 bad events, trust me, the FDA looks at all of those things very carefully. Part of their job is to assess not only efficacy, but the toxicity to determine whether or not this is safe enough for the entire population. So to me, off the top, the 2 biggest harms to this would be the individual patient harm, direct toxicity, and the second one could be that a potential drug, which could be very good for most people, may not make it to market because you have a cohort of people that by chance had a bad toxicity, and therefore the drug is the toxicity is blamed by the drug or is caused by the drug. That's at least what the FDA may see.
I think those are both great points that the doctor made. To the first point, I will say we know what the side effect of not taking the investigational drug is in these situations. I mean, that side effect is irreversible. That side effect is death. Which, quite frankly, as we just indicated, is likely to happen in this situation anyway. But the individual harm that was just discussed, is a factor to be decided by the patient, and that's what Right to Try does. What's important is with the medical advice of their physician. This law, which is often overlooked, the part of this law which is often overlooked is that this is a medical decision where the doctor is the one that has to tell the patient, hey, I'm aware of this therapy out there, it's in phase 2, it's in phase 3, whatever it may be, and I think it's your last and best hope. So it's not the patient medicating, it's the doctor saying, hey, this is your last chance. And then that issue of the individual harm can be handled through informed consent. These patients, and I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of them around the nation, have indicated that what they want in this situation is that control. They want to be able to make that decision. They know there's no guarantees. They know that this could make the rest of their life worse, but they want that choice anyway. So that's the answer to the first harm. The second harm is also very well taken. There's some concern that drugs provided outside the clinical trial testing, the FDA clinical trial, very strict and controlled testing, would potentially delay or even prevent a drug from ultimately being approved. I can tell you that I've had conversations with the FDA. I've sat on panels with a doctor who's about the number 2 doctor in the FDA. His name's Dr. Moshiki, and he guaranteed me and the National Academy of Sciences that the FDA does not look at drugs administered through expanded access or eventually right to try laws outside the clinical trial testing process. They don't look at those results to determine or to affect their approval process. Now, as the doctor sitting next to me just said, I didn't quite believe that answer, and I can tell you that the pharmaceutical companies don't believe that answer. So there is some concern about providing medications even through the current system of expanded access. We're working with the FDA. When he said that the FDA doesn't do that, I asked him, I said, well, make it clear to the public, make it clear to the pharmaceutical companies that you don't use that in their approval process. You don't use those results so people can have access in these situations. I was told that they were working on that. I'm sure they are. But yes, those are legitimate concerns, but they are still, this still comes back to the potential that people have, the potential opportunity that people have to control their destiny and try something that may extend their life based on all the information that they have and their decisions.
Just want to add a little piece regarding the phase 1 trial, and that is actually these are healthy volunteers. The phase 1 is 2,200 people. It's a very, very small group, which then take us to terminally ill. We don't know how they absorb the medications. We don't even know how they metabolize them. We don't know how they excrete them. They have very sick organs, liver failure, kidney failures. So just keep in mind that phase 1 trial drugs are approved by people or tested by people who are healthy volunteers, and it's a very small group.
Is this on? I'd like to reiterate that there is a, if this law gets passed, it's still in conflict with the federal regulations and the FDA. And then that creates a risk for investigators and drug companies because investigators and drug companies are required to report and investigate all adverse reactions. There's less control over the medication being given to patients. It's more difficult to demonstrate efficacy and safety. And that could lead, first of all, it was not approved by the FDA, and the state law provides for giving, allowing the giving of the medicine. It's considered a misbranded drug. And so things could happen that a drug company might worry about, such as clinical holds, injunctions, seizures of the drug, and even arm twisting by the FDA, because there are certain things that the FDA sort of does under the radar that is not necessarily subject to congressional oversight.
On this panel are soon-to-be lawyers, so I apologize. The first statement, I'll address the first statement that this is in conflict with federal regulations. There's disagreement on that, and I would argue that it's not. These laws were designed based on state-based recognition of constitutional liberties. I'm not going to get into a constitutional analysis here at a medical school unless you want me to, but I can tell you that there's jurisprudence out there. I read documents that say, hey, this case out there says we're not allowed to do this, the federal government controls this. Well, I disagree, and it's telling that I'm sitting in the state of Oregon, where the primary case that grants the constitutional support for right to try laws came right out of here. It's called Gonzalez versus Oregon, and it's referenced the very case that Dr. Basham was talking about before, or the very law, the right to die or the death with dignity law here in the state of Oregon. The federal government came in, the Department of Justice, and challenged the state when y'all passed that law, saying it's unconstitutional, conflicts with the Federal Controlled Substance Act, and you can't do it. I'll fast forward a number of years of litigation all the way to the Supreme Court. In 2006, the Supreme Court said no, it's not in conflict with federal law. States have an inherent right to recognize the constitutional liberty interests of its citizens and people within its borders. And medical regulation is traditionally the police power of the state. Because of that, this does not conflict with federal law. The Controlled Substance Act does not preempt this type of statute. The same thing, I'm confident, would happen here if this law were ever challenged, because this is a state recognition of the constitutional liberty interest, whatever you want to call it, of a person's right to save their own life. And if challenged, it's medical regulation. It's well within the province and the police power of the state, and I'm certain the Supreme Court would use Gonzalez versus Oregon as its precedent to uphold these laws.
So we've gone down to the questions, the source or scope of legal authority in question. So does anybody want to address that point that was just made, or should we move on around the scope of legal authority? Go ahead.
Can I just say one thing? So you'd mentioned saving one's life. These therapies that we're talking about in terminally ill patients, they're not going to save their life, okay? Right now, the way it stands right now, a lot of the therapies that we're talking about are not life-saving. They're life-prolonging at best. Okay, these are randomized clinical trials that compare a standard therapy versus an investigational therapy. Nowadays, the best we usually do if there is a positive result, let's say in lung cancer, is 2 to 3 months. Now, there have been examples of extraordinarily powerful medicines. Gleevec's one of the best examples of this, right? Dr. Drucker, who's the head of my cancer center, invented a drug called Gleevec, which profoundly changed the course of CML. There are other blockbuster drugs out there that I would wholeheartedly endorse would be very important for early access for patients. But a lot of the drugs we're talking about are not going to save their lives, okay? The writing on the wall, and unfortunately the elephant in the room, is that we are all going to die. Patients with terminal illnesses, with stage 4 malignancies, don't just magically save their life by taking a pill. Not right now. Maybe in 10, 20 years when we have very perfected molecular targeted therapy, some new stem cell treatment, things like that. Protecting somebody's right in that situation, I think, is a little bit different than protecting somebody's right for a potential benefit of a couple months.
In terms of, I didn't hear anything else about the legal authority. I'm going to move on to the second step here. But before I do, I think what I heard in terms of the risks and harms of concern, there are questions about harm from potential harm from the drug, effect on clinical trials, but on the other side, the risks and harms of not doing anything, or that the patient's going to die, and this might be the only opportunity for them to live longer or not die. I don't know whether I've summarized that well. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I just had one other thing that occurred to me, and that is that because the FDA process has been the only process used in the United States, we're not sure what would happen. Certainly, there's a very large risk that these medically fragile patients are going to be more susceptible to toxicities, either known in phase 1 or not known yet. But there's also the risk that if we do nothing, there's potential benefit to those same patients. And we just don't know because the process is so tight right now and so federally regulated. There hasn't been an opportunity for personal physicians to help their patients through this process and to discover potential benefits out there. So there's a harm to doing nothing, just like there's a harm to doing something. And yes, there's an unknown out there.
So before we call on folks, and I do want the audience to participate, I really want to get into the meat of this. So we're going to step 2. We've heard about some of the risks and harms and concerns. And actually, before we go there, and I will call on folks, I just want to make sure we got all the stakeholders identified before we go into the risks and harms. So we've heard about the industry. We've heard from oncologists. We've heard people talking about patients. Have we left anybody else out in terms of stakeholders and what their moral claims are on this? You want to respond to that?
No, I'm just curious to get a little bit.
Thing, and once you take it out of those clinical trials, what does that put at risk for those companies, their control over their own inventions, things like that?
Well, and we can do this together with regards to, you can correct maybe some of the things that I'm saying, but 8 to 10 years at minimum to bring a drug to actual availability through usual mechanisms. And then phase 1, the audience needs to understand that's maybe given to 20 to 80 people, healthy people, so not a very big cohort. And then looking at phase 1, it's only to tease out those really significant toxicities that appear right away. So now addressing your question, again, the risk is this going to totally jeopardize a clinical trial process because the patient being given it through a state law, the investigator can't see when the toxicities happen because it has to be reported, and other things that jeopardize, again, is, like I've said, that it's misbranded, is considered misbranded. You know, there's that big conflict between the federal law and the state law. And what can you think of? Can you think of anything?
Any other stakeholders? So we've got industry, patients, physicians, healthcare providers. Yes.
Patients, because there may be patients that are unduly influenced to do what the family wants when it's not in their best interest.
Okay, so what moral claims might the family have about this? That they may influence, how would that work? How might that happen? You can go up to the microphone if you want, so other folks.
They can't hear otherwise. So my concern being, I'm a second-year med student, but I also was a critical care nurse for 13 years. So there are times that you will see, and I have seen, patients that don't want something, but they're afraid to tell the family, no, I'm ready to stop. Please stop making me do this. And they are truly suffering for their family's sake, not for their sake.
Okay.
And how do you tease those apart?
Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate what you are saying, because that is also my experience, that they're really family members, and they may have issues, and I hope we'll get into that later, that they have maybe bad conscience and guilt, and I hope we'll address that in a little bit.
If I could just say one more thing, so this is kind of a plug for palliative care in general, but as an oncologist, probably one of my most important jobs is actually providing comfort and symptom management in patients who are dying. I think that's actually probably my most important job, to be totally honest with you. But let me just say that when a patient comes to me and requests the Deaths with Dignity Act, the very first question I ask them is, what is your goal here? What is their main intent? Now, we can all say, oh, it's to live longer. You know, sometimes you may be surprised what people say, and it may come out that the family members want them to do this, or they're saying, well, I'm living just to go to my nephew's birthday or something like that, or I want it to take away my pain. I want it to take away my suffering, things like that. Palliative care is a very effective way of managing people's symptoms. And actually, there have been randomized clinical trials that prove when patients, at least in lung cancer, patients randomized to standard of care plus palliative care versus standard of care, the patients who got palliative care lived longer. There was no difference in number of chemotherapies. There was no difference in therapies. So why is that? It's because effective palliative care makes people live longer. Not more pills, not more clinical trials, really effectively addressing their symptoms. Now, that doesn't happen in everybody, but I'm saying palliative care can be very, very beneficial. In Brittany Maynard's case, that's a very special case. In that situation, I would say that their palliative care is somewhat limited in people who are literally can't talk anymore because their brain is being completely encompassed by a tumor. But in a lot of cases, we are able to very compassionately help people through the dying process. And sometimes it takes talking about very uncomfortable topics with patients to get to that. But the easy thing to do for me is give another pill. The hard thing for me to do is to sit down and ask them, why are you going through what you're going through? How can we help that? We cannot forget how important palliative care is in this whole thing.
So we've been talking about who the stakeholders are and what the risks and harms may be. We only have 20 minutes left, so I want to start to get into the meat of this. And actually, if the right to try legislation passes, I want to go through these steps here. Let's talk about utility first. Would that produce a balance of benefits over harms, now that you've heard what some of the harms on both sides are? So if folks on the panel could address that, would this legislation ultimately produce a balance of benefits over harms? Or not?
I think from my perspective as a physician, anytime I can give a patient an informed choice, that's a benefit.
I think that's really a good point, but another point that I think we need to think about is that terminal ill has not really been defined in the bill, and people can be within 1 year of dying. Hospice is not eligible for people unless they have 6 months, and the same with physician-assisted suicide. So I am really concerned regarding bringing in something where we don't talk about palliative care and don't talk about hospice because people may be being able to live longer and that discussion may not take place.
I think all those are great points as well, and that's why these laws were designed with not only the patient in mind, but the physician. I just heard about the role of the physician as counselor too, about why are you really doing this? What is really best for you? And taking those people through it. I mean, that's, I presume, part of your medical responsibility. And I think as a profession, physicians out there will do that. And you work through, as a physician, with your patient, the best course of action and your best treatments. What these laws do is they give those patients those options. They need to be informed. I mean, there's in Oregon's bill and most of the bills around the country, there's a very, very distinct and detailed informed consent requirement. But the physician is a great part of both the palliative care, whether somebody's seeking to extend their life, try to cure a disease, and the course of medical treatment. And I think all the points that were just made make that very clear that the doctor is a huge part of this.
I'd like to put something in air quotes, informed consent. How do you inform a patient about a drug? How do you inform a patient about a drug that's had maybe a couple hundred people that have had it? Do you truly know what the side effects are? My answer to that is not necessarily. That I think in this idea of informed consent where this person is this autonomous agent and truly can understand the risks and benefits of such therapy, which truly is experimental, I would say informed consent is very wishy-washy. As a physician, you can say a lot of different things about different drugs, and you may not know all the answers, because I can guarantee you with all these different clinical drugs and the clinical trials that we run, that I run, the lists of things that could go wrong is about 15 pages long. So truly informing somebody about this, I would say, is very difficult to achieve. So I'm not disagreeing that this is not a positive thing for many patients in terms of rights, but I would just say that we need to be careful, I think, with informed consent is about a drug that truly does not have a very significant track record.
What I'm going to try to get you guys to talk about right now is the risks and harms. Does this legislation produce a balance of benefit over harms? If you could address that.
I could. I'd like to first say that I completely agree with Dr. Setner on what he was saying about informed consent, and what I think is pretty powerful about this bill is it's kind of a model for the way we should be doing informed consent with patients, because the reality is that we don't know, even when we think we do know about a lot of these medications, because when they're tested in trials, usually the trials will look for kind of the simpler patient on less medications with less medical problems to show that there's a benefit over harms. But when we actually use them in practice, we're dealing with unstandardized, medically complicated patients who are often on more medications with more interactions than have ever been tested. So they're just an N of one in our own study, in our own practice every time. And when we give them informed consent, we're not doing near the job that this legislation requires for the investigational product. The informed consent doesn't just require that one physician do it, it requires that the second physician attest that the patient understands. So if you think about that, the second physician is doing another informed consent and verifying that the patient actually understands how little is known about the medication and that it's investigational. Further, two unbiased witnesses have to sign off that the patient is capable in acting voluntarily. Those witnesses cannot be a member of the person's family, kind of getting at the concern that you had. Those witnesses cannot be a care provider who might also not want their patient to die, be encouraging them to do another therapy. They cannot be somebody who's financially going to benefit one way or another, whether the patient lives longer or doesn't. So it actually has a lot more sideboards than we have in our general informed consent process. It's kind of a model for something that we should strive for in general.
Yeah,
I don't know that certainly there's a lot of areas in which we don't practice as providers, that we know that there are people who provide abortion care services, but most providers don't, or who provide right to die, but most providers don't. And I think similarly, there's going to be physicians who are comfortable with this and physicians who are not. And it's also your choice as a provider to refer or not to refer for this type of therapy.
Anybody else in terms of balance of benefits over harms, or harms over benefits? If not,
I would just like to address quickly with the balance of harms and benefits. Again, one of the harms that we talked about here, or potential harms, I guess, is the damage or potential damage this could do to clinical trials. I just don't think that, from my perspective and the law's perspective, that harm is out there. These laws have been designed with clinical trials as an integral part of their mechanism. The law requires that if a drug is eligible for under right to try, it has to have passed phase 1 of the FDA process as we've discussed, but more importantly, it has to remain in clinical trials. So if for any reason that drug is no longer in a clinical trial moving towards ultimate FDA approval, whether it's a company decision from a financial standpoint, whether it fails, that drug is no longer eligible to be administered under right to try. These laws in many of the states are designed for patients that are either ineligible or unable to get into a clinical trial for whatever that condition may be. By definition, if the patient is ineligible for the clinical trial, their absence from that clinical trial is not going to hurt the clinical trial. Clinical trials are necessary for the right to try laws to move drugs forward, move technology forward, and what will happen eventually, we hope, is that these administrations of investigational new drugs outside the clinical trials, just like with expanded access today, will actually complement the results of those clinical trials in a more, as Dr. Basham said, more real-world setting where people are on other medications, have other indications, and so forth.
I think that the one of the biggest obstacles is, again, the drug companies and whether or not they would cooperate should such a law get passed, because it's been passed in at least 5 states so far, and I'm not sure that many drug companies have been providing drugs to terminally ill patients. But I think the really big advantages over the long term in terms of forcing parties to look at the issue at a national level, including the FDA, it's a strong signal to the federal government. It's no longer an unthinkable concept, and it shows also that the national opinion is changing. And this has occurred before with regards to the FDA in terms of motivating them to change their regulations, such as during the AIDS epidemic.
I'd like to hear from the panel in terms of justice. So if this passes, are the benefits of this as well as the burdens, are they likely to be distributed fairly or equitably? Can you folks address that?
I'm not an expert when it comes to justice. That sounds weird, but I don't believe in justice. No, I from my own experiences with the Deaths with Dignity Act, and the data would show this, is that one of the concerns with the Deaths with Dignity Act was that it would induce people who have crappier lives to want to undergo the Deaths with Dignity Act. In fact, it's actually the opposite. It's people who are the most educated, who probably have the most to lose, quote unquote, because they have the most wealth and have the most knowledge. My guess is that if this passes, a person who would approach me with this is somebody who's pretty well read, who has a very high health literacy, somebody who knows enough to have looked through some of the clinical trials to understand what exactly they're asking for. And my guess is this isn't the rural farmer who's, doesn't read any popular stuff. Maybe he watches the news every once in a while. But my guess is that this will be a bill that will be utilized by one cohort of people the most. Whether or not that's injustice or not, I think is up for debate.
think we should keep in mind the Institute of Medicine's report that came out last year, Dying in America, that we really are lagging back still on end-of-life care, advanced care planning, setting goals, having the discussions, and at least 25% of Americans haven't even thought about that. And that really comes back to, I think, what you were saying, who are the people who have these discussions and who don't have these discussions, and they will also be left out. So really take a look at the Institute of Medicine's report, because I think we are still lagging way back.
Anybody else on the panel on that one? No. Okay. Anybody in the audience? Yes.
I was at the UC Davis Stem Cell Ethics Conference last month, and probably the two biggest topics of conversation were right to try and illegal stem cell clinics. And basically all the patient representatives agreed that what happens is if you don't have right to try or something like it, if you have the money, you go to the illegal stem cell clinics that have no regulation of any kind. And that's a huge growing industry in the U.S. It isn't just the middle of nowhere and godforsaken someplace in South America. So people will do this one way or another.
Did anyone want to respond to that? Or okay. One of the things that I've seen throughout what you guys have been talking about are questions of equity just sort of peppered throughout. So it's like once you've jumped through the hoops, you have this diagnosis, everything, you've checked off all of your boxes, you've got your doctor signed off, the pharmaceutical company is going to provide the thing. Who's going to actually get it? It's only people that have money to pay for it. That's not a huge chunk of our society. Sick people with low SES get sick just as much, if not more, than those of high SES. So why do they get to benefit when the others don't? And then the other question one of the other questions, so if this damages, jeopardizes randomized control trials, will those who can't afford the treatment out of pocket then also lose the ability for insurance to pay for it later? So they're kicked twice, I mean, two different ways. And then the other one is who bears the cost of the adverse events? Insurance companies won't pay, and in fact, they'll try to get out of paying what they should pay anyways. If the patient runs out of money, you don't just kick them out of the hospital. You're going to keep caring for them. So who truly pays for that? And is that a fair distribution of resources for something that is truly experimental?
I'll go ahead and address the money question, the first question, because I've heard that question about equity or concern about equity, frankly, everywhere. And the system, I'll start with saying the system we have now is not equitable. We try to make it equitable, but it's not. That's just the reality. What right to try laws will do is actually make it more equal, give more access to people. Dr. Basham discussed a young man from Arizona named Diego Morris. Diego Morris was struck at 11 with an osteosarcoma of his leg. Now fast forward, that couldn't be treated here in the U.S. He went to children's clinics in Tennessee. They recommended that there was one drug that could help him, but it wasn't available in the United States. It was in use for a number of years prior to his diagnosis in England. And of course, like every parent in that situation says, parents ask the doctor, what would you do if it were your child? And the doctor said, I would go to England. I would find any way to go to England. Well, Diego was fortunate enough to have a family of some means, have a family that within 7 days was able to pack up not only him and his entire family, but his brother, and move to London, where he was treated with the drug for about 9 months. I can't remember how many treatments, and is now cancer-free. What Right to Try will do will allow that treatment to take place in America. It'll allow that treatment to take place right here in Oregon, where the people that don't have the ability to travel to England, uproot their family for an entire year, will have access. Is everybody going to have access, and is it going to be perfect? No, we wish it could, but this is going to make it better. And the argument that it's unequal, even though it's better, it's still unequal, so we shouldn't do it, just doesn't fly. If we can take a step forward, which Right to Try does, we should do that. So I disagree. The money, it won't just be for the rich. This is bringing people closer. in the expanded access program that the FDA currently does the very same thing that we're talking about, although it's a long and super drawn out process and people die waiting for permission. It's the same thing. There's no guarantee to equal access, but the good news is most of the pharmaceutical companies that do agree to participate in this provide the medications for free. Not all of them, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. Sometimes they can't. It depends on supply. I mean, there's a lot of factors. But often these treatments are provided for free, and the expectation would be that a similar process would take place here.
So I just have a comment, and you have probably heard I speak funny, so I'm actually from Europe, and before we start saying not approved in the US versus in the UK, we have to ask ourselves, what process did the drug go through in the UK? Was it a first phase trial? Had it been approved by another country, and had it been tested? And then to what extent had it been tested, and by whom and with whom? So when we hear these both pros and cons, I think that adds more questions to cases like this.
I have a question. So I have no experience with end-of-life care, but it seems like a lot of this hinges on informed consent. I just wonder if it's really possible to get informed consent with experimental drugs. We were talking about how the physicians can't really know what it's going to be. If you tell a patient we have something that might help you, and they're at the end of their life, is it really possible to get informed consent from them for this?
I think that's a terrific question, and I've lost a lot of night's sleep thinking about that. My answer is no. I don't think it's possible when you're in a position of dying and you want to have hope that saying this one more therapy might help you. There's a 1% chance it could benefit you. A lot of people will clutch onto that, and they're going to ignore the 15 pages of side effects that happens. I've done this before. I've given patients the informed consent. They look through it and they look at me and they go, well, what do you think I should do? And I say, I really want you to read the informed consent. And they get through page 2 and page 3 and they just look at this and say, I want to keep on living. And I think it's a very challenging position. I think when somebody has so much at risk and so much skin in the game, their life, I think it's very difficult to be truly informed about this. Now, again, that's a nature of what we do every day, whether or not it's a standard chemotherapy or whatever. It's not like this is a particular situation where informed consent is more risky, although I'd say you can make a case for that since there's less data with the drug. That's just my 2 cents.
I agree with everything that Dr. Suttner said. I hope I'm also pronouncing his name correctly. I don't know that I am. At any rate, I think at the end of life, this is where it's critical to develop some skills talking to patients and clarifying goals with the patient and knowing your patient really well and knowing who they are. Because you as a physician have to make some calls about not offering things at the end of life just as much as you do about offering things at the end of life. If you've determined that it's futile, then you have an ethical obligation not to be offering this or any other curative therapy, and to be with your patient and guiding them to acceptance of that and giving them what they need in terms of palliation and comfort care. So it's a difficult question. It's obviously a very gray area, but it takes time and practice and experience to develop that confidence to be able to make those calls. And there are limitations to informed consent, whether it's an investigational product or whether it's a medicine we've used for 60 years. There's always going to be a gray area about what to do at that stage in life, and it just takes practice and experience.
So I had a question kind of following up Mr. Altman's comments around pricing for these investigational products. I think you had alluded to there are a lot of factors that go into whether or not patients are charged for these investigational products. And I think one of the things that I've learned kind of doing a little bit of research is that oftentimes companies provide these medicines, these investigational products for free because they don't want their cost data coming out. And so I'm wondering, to synthesize some of the steps that Dr. Melnick, you're proposing up there on the justice versus respect for liberty, it seems like Right to Try is about enhancing a patient's liberty to make a choice and to have physicians to be able to work in partnership with patients to have them have that ability for liberty and to have that choice. There were some allusions earlier in the panel around how the state legislation drives the FDA to have a different conversation around the proposed, the current process of drug development and approval. And I wondered if you could talk about maybe some of the burdens that the intended effect to the FDA is if you're asking the FDA to reconsider their drug approval process, what burdens kind of nationwide adoption of right to try would place on the FDA. Thank you.
That's the last question is just very thoughtful and a great question, and certainly laws and legislation that sweep the nation in whatever area, this happens to be healthcare and the FDA, do drive change. And if that is an incidental effect of right to try laws, then so be it. You know, the FDA hasn't changed, essentially hasn't changed their approval process since 1962 when it was developed. I'm sitting here with a number of doctors who I'm sure will tell me that medical technology has significantly advanced since 1962, and sometimes just like a cell phone in the 1980s was about as big as a telephone booth, now we carry computers in our pockets, and the FDA really hasn't adapted to that advancement in medical technology, to individualized medicine, to genomic mapping and DNA testing, to design therapies for small groups or even individuals. So yes, the FDA at some point may have to react, and I can tell you that they already have, or they're at least trying. They have an expanded access program, which we haven't talked too much about tonight, or compassionate use is a word they use interchangeably with it, that does exactly what right to try is intended to do, exactly what right to try laws are designed to expedite. It grants access to certain terminally ill patients, or maybe even other patients, depending on their condition, to investigational new medicines that are somewhere within the track that could be beneficial. It's an extremely long and arduous process for a doctor and a manufacturer to go through to get this FDA approval. Often it takes months. They will tell you that they the FDA approves almost 100% of those requests, and that's true. It's about 99%, 98, 99%, but they don't get very many requests because of how long it takes. Well, based on right to try, which is really the expanded access program, is really one of the catalysts to the right to try movement because it takes so long. The FDA has just recently, I think as late as or early as February, proposed a change to their expanded access program. Their own literature prior to their proposed change, and it's proposed, it hasn't changed yet, indicated that doctors like Dr. Setner would take over 100 hours of their time to fill out the application process for a patient that may benefit from expanded access. That's just the physician time. Physician that obviously is busy, I would presume, has a lot of patients. And I've literally talked to physicians across the country that said, we just can't do it. We don't offer it to our patients. We talk about it, but we can't do it. It's not navigable. That's only one part. The manufacturer has to do a bunch. The FDA has a certain amount of time to make the approval. If you finally get through that approval, it has to come back to a local institutional review board. It takes time, and when time really is of the essence. That's a long story to say, you know, we're very happy that the FDA, after 50 years, is looking to improve things. They have proposed a rule to take that 100-hour time frame of physician time and reduce it to one piece of paper that they claim will take 45 minutes. It's a proposed rule. Of course, a guy like me, who's a lawyer, a little sarcastic sometimes, says if it took 100 hours on Thursday, why can it only take 45 minutes on Friday? Why did it take 100 hours in the first place? But be that as it may, they know there's an issue, and they're trying to improve that. So that's the first step. And the first evidence that we see that the FDA may react to this. And if this movement helps the FDA improve all its approval process and all its processes and really adapt to the 21st century technology of medicine, then that would be fantastic.
And maybe you can clarify it for me, is the grounds for what constitutes an appropriate investigational product. And I've done cancer research, and the way I think of it is there's a study out there that's phase 2, and there's a paper that comes out showing that the target of that study, that therapy, is similar to a genomic analysis of the cancer that I'm working with. and therefore it's like, oh, well, maybe it works, maybe it won't. I guess what's the evidence-based grounds for actually trying a product as opposed to saying, yeah, it's out there, it's cancer, let's throw it at it. Because having worked with cancer, cancers are obviously very different. And so is there any evidence grounds to choosing an investigational product?
Well, let me just interject real quickly there. Hopefully, I mean, I think that the bill has a lot of safeguards. Hopefully the physician would interpret that and say, no way, right? I'm not going to extrapolate, a cell line in a mouse, to this, even though there's some, phase 1 data in a different patient set. I'm not going to all of a sudden assume that it's going to work for you. That would be my initial impression, would be that the physician would hopefully look at that paucity of data and say, this ain't going to work. But I guess under this system, you would have to have another, let's say that I was a physician who just didn't know what the hell he was talking about and just said, sure, let's just do that. There still have to be another physician that signs off on it and says, look, this makes sense.
Benefits and burdens. I don't know maybe if Chandra could speak to this or not, but the decision in Oregon to exclude children who are already have less access to clinical trials and therefore less access to investigational drugs even within our current system. What was the thinking behind that went on? Do you have any light to shed on that?
I wish that I did, and actually the answer I got was that there was no thinking or no principle behind restricting it to above 15. It was a political concession to the insurance industry. So I'm hopeful for Oregon children that will be changed in the Senate, but I'm not sure if there's any support to do that. I do think in terms of analyzing the risk to the population versus the risk to the individual, there's a greater win to be had for that exact reason for children, because they don't have access to a lot of these clinical trials. And there's a greater win to society too. If we know a child's within a year of death and we can extend, someone who's under 15, their life that much longer, they have that much more time with their family. I mean, that's an incredible gain for society that we're just leaving out there and leaving children less than 15 out of.
But at the same time, the informed consent then is almost impossible, because you can't take a 4-year-old child and inform them of what you're about to do.
That's exactly right. And so it would be the same for children 15 to 18. It would be their parents would be the one who would be doing informed consent, just like for the rest of their medical care.
And sometimes we can't really trust parents to do a very good job of that.
Or patients themselves, but
Patients themselves, whereas the parent is impacting another person.
That's right. But when we're dealing with a neonate or a preschooler, that's the best option. Would be their parent or their next of kin, their legal guardian. Would be the person that we would trust would have their interests closest to heart.
So we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to ask the panel members, this is the third part of the analysis here. Based on what we've heard, if you guys could address whether you feel this legislation is likely to accomplish the goal, whether the benefits outweigh the moral considerations here. Is it necessary? I heard that the FDA is moving along anyway in spite of this. Are the burdens and benefits distributed fairly based on what you heard? Is this the least, well, it sounds like this is the least intrusive way, but maybe you can address that. And whether this legislation can be, whether we can, hearing all that we've heard, whether we can justify it or not. Anybody want to take all those on?
Yes. Yeah, quadruple yes. I'll take a shot. I always like to, I'll focus, though, on the necessary. Dr. Melnick just indicated other things, something else that I've heard a lot of places. Now, all of a sudden, the FDA is saying they're going to fix the expanded access program. So why is right to try necessary? Well, number one, as I indicated, their reduction in one part of the expanded access program, the physician paperwork, so far has not taken place. It is a proposal. I presume, and I have no reason to believe that that proposal won't eventually go into effect, but it's a rule, and under rulemaking authority, that rule can be withdrawn at any time. But even if it's not, that does not really accelerate the expanded access program the necessary amount. People still die waiting for, and not to say they would live otherwise, but waiting for access to investigational new drugs that a doctor has determined could be effective for them because of the time it takes. There's still a significant amount of work that needs to be done through the expanded access request and paperwork that's provided from the manufacturer to the FDA. The FDA has, by their rule, 30 days once they have gathered all that material to make a decision on whether to grant access to this drug. The kicker is that if there's any questions, which there often is, I mean, this is a complicated process, the FDA will send those paperwork back to their respective parties, and when they get the questions answered, that material returned, that 30-day clock starts again. So it is typically a 2 to 4 month process to get through the expanded access program. The FDA will tell you they grant access over the telephone. I've heard it 1,000 times in the last 6 months. I have never talked, and I believe it probably happens, but I have not talked to one patient or doctor that has gotten approval over the telephone. The fastest I've heard is a woman named Andrea Sloan in Texas who died of ovarian cancer waiting for a drug that had been proven relatively effective to treat her disease. Her approval happened in 28 days. So that's, what, 4 weeks. I'm bad at math. I'm a lawyer. That's the fastest I've heard. I'm sure there's some faster examples out there, but I have not come across them. So is this law necessary? Yes, this law will expedite that system, will expedite access to these drugs and bring them closer again to the people that need them in a timely fashion. That's the goal, and I think it will eventually conquer that goal. It'll make it better.
Here's your chance, everybody, to weigh in on this. I know you all have different views, so.
I still am cautious. There's one thing we haven't touched on is really quality of life. And we know palliative care actually increases quality of life versus maybe people being on clinical trials. So I really think having the discussion with patients, not about extending life, because that's not a given on any of these drugs, but palliative care actually, as has been shown in the clinical trial regarding extending life, does extend life. So my concern is really that hospice and palliative care are not included in these conversations, and particularly because of the 6-month guidelines for both hospice and palliative care. Palliative care should be early on referred to, or people should be referred to palliative care, but it doesn't happen. It's still in hospitals most of the time, so that's my 2 cents.
And I would agree with what you said as well. We do a terrible job as a profession of getting people into hospice and palliative care quickly enough. We probably do better with cancer than any other disease process at recognizing when people are at the end of life. I do want to emphasize, in Oregon in particular, we've put safeguards around that decision for doctors and patients so that if someone's electing to do a right to try therapy and this bill becomes law, they don't have to go off hospice if their goals are still palliation. There's plenty of chemotherapies out there that we use for palliative purposes, and so if that's the goal of the treatment, that's a non-FDA approved investigational product, then they wouldn't have to go off hospice or palliative care. And that right to try should definitely be a part of an overall discussion about care goals for a patient. So
I'll let Chris go last. He'll have to say the last word. So I have very mixed feelings about this. I think I approach this from 3 different perspectives. One, as a researcher, I believe very firmly in clinical trials. Now, some clinical trials are run better than others, but when people say, this person was not eligible for a clinical trial, you need to ask yourself, what does that mean? Does that mean that they were 500 miles away from the nearest clinical trial with this? Does that mean that they weren't eligible because they were too sick? Does it mean because there was some other eligibility issue? You know, the reason why these clinical trials are made is because we want to try to make them safe and effective for patients. If you have a patient, we have very strict eligibility criteria and we have very specific ways of monitoring for toxicity. If somebody goes on one of these investigational drugs without going on a clinical trial, my guess is that person will not be monitored nearly as closely as they would be on the clinical trial. So one could conclude, again, that patient may be at increased risk of harm as opposed to one who is going on the clinical trial. Again, there's a lot of safeguards in place with these clinical trials, too much so sometimes. But so as a researcher, I have mixed views about that. As a clinician, my obligation and duty is to the patient. Well, what is best for them? Now, defining what is best for them is tricky, right? For some people, it might be very obvious. If there's a therapy that will prolong their life significantly with low toxicity, I think most people, most clinicians would say that's a good bet. Yes, I would agree with that. And if it means that we have to use this legislation to do that, I think that's a reasonable way to do it. But again, I think defining what's best for the patient is really the key here. The devil's in the details. And I think you can sometimes treat the patient and give them what is best, but not having to go to a situation like this where you are potentially giving them therapy that could potentially harm them. What you're not going to hear in any TV advertisement or newspaper is, you know, my husband or wife got a drug on this type of program and they died early. That's not going to win any TV commercials. You're not going to hear these folks talking about that, right? Nobody goes on a blog and says, I took some weird extract and I died. You know, so we have to remember that we're going to hear a lot of really amazing stories about Diegos who go and get cured because therapies aren't available here in the United States. Those are very powerful anecdotes. But do we change our legislation based on those few cases? There's a lot at stake with stuff like this. And I think we just need to be aware of that, is that not only as a clinician, but as a citizen, this has ramifications. And so I think as a researcher, clinician, and as a citizen, I have very mixed views of this.
So I got invited here to take the perspective from the drug companies, and I tend to be relatively pro-states' rights, so it may not sound that way. But nevertheless, I think given what has happened in other states, that this legislation will probably pass because number one, it's a very sympathetic issue, and it was unanimous in the House. And then also from the drug companies' perspective, it's a voluntary program from the perspective of the drug companies. So there's not necessarily that much resistance from drug companies. And I just think that even though it passes, I think the jury's still out with regards to, whether or not it's going to be successful in achieving what we might want it to achieve. And I think that really the long-term big picture is the most important with regards to, showing, it's sort of like the marijuana laws with regards to, because that's totally in conflict with federal law too, but it's showing that the national opinion is changing. And again, it's like turning around an ocean liner, the federal government. So I think that this is just one more piece that will show that the national opinion is changing.
Now I know about the delay, the microphone delay.
I want to thank all the speakers for coming today to talk to us about this really important and current event. Thank you to the audience members for coming today. Thank you to the Benjamin Rush Institute and the Arthur N. Roop Foundation for sponsoring this discussion. Have a wonderful night.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes.
Have any of you changed your minds about this or thought more about it or as a result of this? Change your mind?
Just now? Like during this hour?
Yeah.
Yes. I did.
Jasper, tell us about these.
Well, I came in thinking, yeah, of course, everyone should have access to these drugs. This makes total sense. And now I kind of feel like, well, it'd be really hard for me if I was about to die to make an informed choice about this. And is it perhaps limiting patients' choices, in fact, to say, here are a bunch more options, and if patients actually want to be able to die peacefully, now they're having pressure from their family and perhaps other people saying, well, there are all these other options. Why aren't you pursuing this? Why are you giving up? So that's kind of more of would be my concern.
Anybody else out there? Yeah.
I agree. I came into it kind of thinking this is a no-brainer and we should all support this, and I think some very valid concerns were raised. I think I'm probably still more pro, but maybe I'd look for some more checks and balances in the law.
I think for me, what I didn't really consider is that towards the end of life, if we're prolonging these people's lives, then it's going to be not necessarily a great way to go. Like, we're going to put them through these trials, and it's going to be a really painful way to die a lot of times, and we just don't know what to expect. And I think it's really unfortunate that patients will have to experience that after going through probably already a traumatic course of chemo or whatever they're going through. So.
Great. Thanks, everybody.